This session is titled Understanding the Peak Demand Reduction Scheme. It's designed to help you understand how the scheme works and will hopefully give you a clearer understanding of how you might get involved. I want to start off by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today and the ongoing connection to the lands and waters of New South Wales where our schemes operate and have impact on the people and the environment. I pay my respects to elders past and present and welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session.
So here's a run through of what we'll be covering in today's session. The first item is an overview of the context and legislative instruments that bring the PDRS to life. And then we'll cover the two main options to get involved. We'll then move on to the different roles within the scheme operations. I'll introduce Tessa, who may end up being your new best friend. I'll cover off on the ACP accreditation process and timelines just briefly. I'll outline the compliance procedures and nominations. I'll go through the characteristics of peak reduction certificates. And then, as I mentioned, we'll wrap the session up with a Q&A. It's in Menti. If you join late, just pop into the Zoom chat and you'll be able to see the link to get there and the access code. So now onto the overview of the legislative framework for the peak demand reduction scheme. So the energy security safeguard is a key element of the electricity strategy, and it's aimed at providing more affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy for New South Wales. The PDRS is one of 3 schemes within the energy security safeguard. We've also got the energy saving scheme, which has been delivering energy upgrades to households and businesses since 2009. And then we've got the renewable fuel scheme, which is yet to kick off. Onto the legislative framework. And there are 4 key pieces of PDRS specific legislation. We've got the Electricity Supply Act, which sets out the framework of the PDRS. Any changes to the Act need to go through Parliament. We've got the regulation, which describes the core functions of the scheme administrator and regulator, among other things. And the regulations for the Electricity Supply General Regulation is made under the authority of the Electricity Supply Act. We've got the PDRS rule, which establishes eligibility requirements and calculation methods, and changes to the PDRS rule require approval from the Minister for Energy. And then we've got the ACP's accreditation notice, which tells you what you're accredited to do under the scheme, and I'll cover this in more detail in a few slides' time. The scheme administrator has the function to make and change ACP accreditation notices. And just to mention, on the legislative framework, I'm not covering off on any other key pieces of legislation that you're required to follow, such as Australian consumer law, wiring standards, installation standards, the list goes on. Looking at the PDRS fundamentals now. So the principal scheme objective is to create a financial incentive to reduce peak demand for electricity by encouraging activities that create peak demand reduction capacity. When we talk about capacity to reduce demand in peak times, we're referring to the 2:30 to 8:30 period Australian Eastern Standard Time, which in New South Wales refers to 3:30 to 9:30 p.m. Australian Daylight Savings Time. This is the peak demand reduction period. In terms of the compliance period, it's the 1st of November to the 31st of March. And this compliance year runs from the 1st of April through to the end of the March in the following year. This period is important for certificate vintages, and I'll go through this later in the session. We've got 3 calculation methods in the peak demand reduction scheme. The first is reducing demand using efficiency. Just back one slide, sorry. First is reducing demand using efficiency. This is a demand saving method where the equipment such as high efficiency air conditioner draws less power during hot times than the old air conditioner it's replacing, so you're saving a little bit of demand. We've got the shift and store capacity, which is a demand shifting method. In the example of batteries, the battery being installed is storing solar generation during the day and discharging during the peak, offsetting demand from the grid. And then the third method is the household annual demand response, which is a demand response method. And then using the example of batteries again, the battery capacity that is signed up through BESS2 is able to be drawn upon by a demand response aggregator. The PDRS deals with capacity only, not actual demand response. So the incentives that are available through the PDRS, they're all deemed for the lifetime of the activity based on the estimated impact. Onto the PDRS as a certificate scheme. And just to be clear, the PDRS is a market-based certificate scheme, and it's not a rebate scheme. And I'll explain this a little bit more. So the government does not set a certificate price, and the value of one certificate fluctuates based on the supplier. Just this year, it's ranged from as low as $1 to up to $2.30. And there can be some period of time between the ACP acquiring a customer, the certificate's being created, and then it can be even longer for the ACP to find a buyer if they haven't already got them lined up. Depending on market conditions, it can take a while. So ACPs take the risk that the installation has been done in accordance with all the requirements under the legislation. They also take the risk that they'll be able to find a buyer for the certificates, and then they take a risk on the actual certificate price itself when they go to sell it, that it'll be attractive enough for them. So working backwards, the PDRS places an obligation through the Electricity Supply Act, which I mentioned earlier, on scheme participants, which are mainly electricity retailers, to surrender a certain number of peak reduction certificates each year. ACPs create PRCs by working with businesses and households to implement activities like installing more efficient appliances, as I mentioned earlier, or installing a household battery that can reduce demand during peak times. So it means the ACP can offer a discount to households and businesses on eligible activities in return for being assigned the right to create the peak demand reduction generated by the activity. So moving on to the PDRS rule. So the PDRS rule is where the calculation methods and activity definitions live. It's a key piece of legislation that covers things such as the timing of activities, what a capacity holder is. It also covers what a recognized peak activity is and what isn't, the creation of peak reduction certificates, and then it has a lot of detail on the requirements for each activity and for the calculation methods. So this is where you can find all the details you need to be able to calculate how many certificates a particular battery or air conditioner can generate. Moving on to the method guide now. And the method guide provides guidance about the general requirements for the PDRS and the specific requirements for each calculation method and activity under the PDRS. It also sets out requirements that are referred to in the accreditation conditions. So you should become familiar with the PDRS method guide if you're an applicant seeking accreditation as an accredited certificate provider. The method guide will assist you to understand what's involved in creating a PRC from an activity under the PDRS. And then also it'll help you complete your application for accreditation. If you're already in a PDRS ACP operating under the peak demand savings activities, it'll assist you in understanding and complying with your legislative requirements as well as your accreditation conditions when creating certificates. And if you're an auditor, it'll assist you in checking an ACP's compliance with the PDRS requirements. Moving on to the accreditation notice now, and this is the structure of our accreditation notices. The accreditation notice sets out the activities for which the ACP is accredited to do, and also the conditions of accreditation, including the audit requirements, importantly. So you can apply to change your accreditation notice at any time. The application must be made on TESA and include the required information. Next, I'm going to go through the role of an ACP in a little bit of detail, and then the different options to get involved, because of course, you don't need to be an ACP. So the first option is to become accredited as an ACP. Before you do this, you need to understand what it means to operate as an ACP, including the costs of participation, so the accreditation process and the audit costs, and then the online systems you'll need to access. You'll need to understand the legal requirements and obligations of an ACP. You'll need to work out what you do with the PRCs that you create. So the certificates have value, but not until you figure out what to do with them and you find a buyer. If you do decide to apply to become an ACP, you need to be mindful that participation as an ACP will require your business to meet administrative costs and obligations. Your record keeping and business processes must be of a high standard, and they'll be assessed both during the application process and while you are accredited, for example, through independent audits. And just to be clear, we do treat non-compliance seriously, and non-compliance can lead to financial and legal consequences. You can see our compliance guide for more details on that. So the ACP is responsible for the conduct of any third parties involved in activities undertaken on their behalf. So the installer may be doing the installation, but the ACP is responsible for their conduct. And this includes the customer engagement training and awareness of all of the legal requirements. So have a look at whether working with an existing ACP might be more convenient or appropriate for you. For example, if your activity is small, if you're doing a one-off project, or if your business doesn't have the capacity to meet the PDRS legal requirements. Some ACPs are end-to-end, but some have a similar role to that of the rec agent in the SRES. But I guess the key thing for installers is to become involved. You need to have the relevant licensing and accreditations. So TESA holds the list of all of the ACPs in the PDRS and which activity definitions they're accredited for. So if you're an installer, you're able to find a relevant ACP very easily. But just to note, there are currently no ACPs accredited for the battery activities. We'll be actually starting to accept applications for ACPs under the battery activities from tomorrow, the 1st of August. Moving on to roles within the scheme. So starting off with the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, they're the policy maker. So they develop the PDRS policy, they determine which activities make it into the scheme and how many certificates a particular activity yields. They update and consult on the legislation to support the policy intent. The scheme administrator, that's IPART. IPART assesses applications to become an ACP. We also monitor the ACP compliance and manage the certificate registry, among other things. New South Wales Fair Trading and the Building Commission license tradespeople. They conduct inspections and investigate unsafe practices, and they also handle complaints about licensed tradespeople. And there is also external accreditation and product lists for some PDRS activities. So using batteries as an example, one of the requirements is for the installer to be accredited by Solar Accreditation Australia. So Solar Accreditation Australia is an external installer accreditation body that keeps a list of accredited installers. Their accreditation process is for individual installers to ensure they've got appropriate training, and it's separate from the ACP accreditation that happens under IPART and that IPART administers. So their compliance scheme is focused on particular activities that their compliance scheme is focused on particular individual accredited installers. So they may share information with IPART when non-compliance is detected, and likewise, IPART may share information with Solar Accreditation Australia. Moving on to TESA. So TESA is the Energy Security Safeguard Application. That's what TESA stands for. TESA allows ACPs to submit applications for accreditation and amendment, submit implementation data sheets when they're going to register a certificate. It's the certificate registry and allows for the sort of transfer of certificates to be tracked and the ownership of certificates. It's not a trading platform, just to be clear. Trading occurs outside of TESA, and ACPs are responsible for arranging the sale of certificates. TESA also allows ACPs to start and track audits. And before you even apply to become an ACP, you need to register an account. And you can register an account using the Register Here button down the bottom of that screen. This is a screenshot of the actual TESA portal. As an auditor, you'll be allocated ACP audits by the ACPs who raise them. You'll be able to submit documents, complete tasks, and communicate with IPART about audits. As a scheme participant, you can use TESA now to view holdings and acquire certificates in the registry. You can also surrender certificates. You can notify us about exemptions and liable demand, and you can lodge your annual statements. And then as a member of the public, you have visibility over implementations that have taken place under the scheme by activity definition and by postcode. Next, I'm going to go into how to become an ACP. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this one. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You should have all of the information you need to be able to put together an application between the application session that Fernando ran last Thursday, the 18th of July, and the applications pack that was sent around in the invite for this session. If you missed any of that, you can find the recording on the website, and a link was sent in the EDM for this session. But if you didn't get that EDM, then you can check out our batteries webpage and find the recording there. So the key message with our accreditation process is that the quality of the application really determines the time it takes for an application to be processed. New businesses might need a little bit more time to develop or enhance their systems and documentation to meet the PDRS requirements. Looking at the next slide where we talk about completing an application form, it does take a lot of time and effort. When it comes to completing an application form, you need to really understand the requirements of the activity you're becoming accredited for. If you're interested in batteries, for example, read the PDRS rule, read the method guide, understand all of the requirements, and know what information you need to provide as part of an implementation and the evidence you need to collect for certificate creation. If you can't apply to become an ACP, thinking you'll figure out your systems later on. The systems need to be functional and ready as if you're going to do a job and be able to collect all of the relevant information and keep records. So you've got to take your time to prepare documents, complete your application forms, and we want to see some really great applications come in. So some applications can come in later than others, but they'll get approved quicker because they're complete and there's no back and forth with RFIs, requests for information. Cool, onto audits. So audits are one of the mechanisms we use to monitor compliance and performance under the peak demand reduction scheme. So an ACP arranges and pays for an auditor from the audit service panel. Audit requirements are opposed through ACP's accreditation notice. That's the one I mentioned earlier in the slide. And the requirements include the certificate creation limits, so the volumetric limits, the audit frequency and the nature of audits, so whether they're pre or post registration, the volume of certificates to withhold or to forfeit if required, and then the scope of audits as well. So new ACPs usually start with pre-registration audits and change to periodic audit conditions with the certificate creation limit after completing an audit. It's typical to start with low unaudited certificate creation limit and then increase in stages as ACPs gain experience and establish a compliance history. IPART engages with both ACPs and the auditor during key points throughout the audit process, and we regularly share information with other regulators. Next, on to how certificates are created. So before you get to TESA with your certificates to register, there are a few key steps. Firstly, to create certificates, you need to be an ACP. The concept of nomination in the PDRS is similar to that of the SRES. The customer is assigning their rights to create the certificate over to the ACP. This is important because the PDRS rule requires the ACP to be nominated as the capacity holder before the implementation date. That means you can't install equipment retrospectively and create certificates for installations that happened before you became accredited. And after implementing the activity, you need to calculate the number of certificates and do an internal audit of the implementation before going on to register the certificates in TESA. Next, on to registering and selling certificates. So upload data for each implementation in TESA includes information such as the address, the calculation method and activity definition, the national metering identifier for PDRS activities from the 1st of November, installer details for BESS 1, where we're concerned with installations, the cost to the customer, We've got peak reduction capacity actually created. So TESA does create the PRCs, or it does calculate the PRCs that are created from an implementation. The certificate registration fee applies for each registration, and certificates must be registered within 6 months after the end of the compliance period. So where the compliance period is ending on the 31st of March, you need to register certificates by the 30th of September. One important thing to note, in the SRES, where there is a certificate clearinghouse in the REC registry, and certificates are automatically sold for $40 per certificate where there is a deficit, that function does not exist under the PDRS. All certificate sales happen outside of TESA, and the transfer of certificates needs to happen in TESA. So next, I'm going to go on to the certificate life and vintage. And this is where it might get a little bit complicated, but we'll work through it. So certificates have vintages that are based on the implementation date of the actual activity. For example, if a battery is installed on the 1st of November 2024, it'll create certificates with a 2025 vintage onwards. Certificates expire 3 years after the capacity is first made available. So if you did that battery installation on the 1st of November 2024 and didn't do anything with those certificates by the end of the 2027 compliance period, those 2025 vintage certificates would have expired. Next, on to forward creation. And just adding to what I've said in the previous slide, certificates can be created for the life of the implementation. So where you've got an implementation where the lifetime is 15 years, there'll be certificates with 15 vintages created. And all certificates are active from registration. So this means a scheme participant is able to buy and surrender certificates with a 2030 vintage to meet their 2024 certificate liability. In terms of expiry, the 3-year certificate life does not begin until the year in which the capacity is taken to have been made available. So that means that a certificate with a 2026 vintage won't expire until the end of 2029, even if it's registered today. So we're at the point where the presentation's ended and we're going to start the Q&A in Menti.